collaboratively by the Institute of European Studies and the Brussels Institute of Contemporary China Studies, of which I am the director. Today we tackle the theme Engaging the Great Powers. The session will try to take stock of the security dimension of the European Union's partnership with Asia's regional powers, China, India and Japan. And both speakers of today will give their opinion on the desirability and the options for a more comprehensive strategy towards these partners. I'm very delighted to present our both speakers of today. The lecture will start with Evelyn, who is a reader at the Royal Holloway College, University of London, and she is there in international relations and related to the Department of Politics and International Relations. And second, we will have Dr. Axel Berkofsky, who has been for a long time with us in Brussels, but now has chosen to stay in Italy. The weather is much better. And Axel is actually adjunct professor at the University of Milano and also co-head of the research unit Chinese Investments in Europe at the Center of Advanced Studies on Contemporary China in Torino. So, Evelyn, you may take it.
Thank you. Do I have to stand there too?
Basically, yes.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Unfortunately, I have a PowerPoint presentation. I have to stand here, I think. Thank you very much for the very kind invitation. I was given the loose job of talking about the great powers in Asia, which is only, China and Japan and India, which amongst them only have about 2 million people and a series of really diverse policies. So I've chosen to focus the talk on China's rise, so what for Asia. There's going to be a sort of broad overview of the main implications for Asian security of China's rise, and some 3 ways of thinking about it at the end. Of course, a caveat for some of what's on the slides now is that obviously, especially for the economic slides, things are changing very quickly, and these figures probably don't actually amount to much anymore today. That's okay, because our focus today is on security. So I'll just go through those quite quickly. Right. Obviously, when one looks at the rise of China today, this is a quote that comes up a lot. The reference to China as a sleeping giant, for a long time inert, not having taken its place in the world, and now in today's world having woken up and shaking the world as such. In my talk, I may suggest to you possibly that China is making an impact in the world, but that it's not shaking the world to the extent and degree that many writers and speakers would like to have us believe. My view comes a bit closer to Jerry Siegel, who was, before his death, a very, very well-known, one of the best-known China specialists in the United Kingdom. He wrote a very, very provocative article in 1999 in which he alleged that China basically is overrated. China is a theoretical power, not a real one. Its power has lain in its promise to deliver, most of the time with a promise that hasn't been fulfilled. In other words, a second-rank little power, he calls China, which has consistently disappointed the world over the last 150 years. So we ought to be a bit careful about how we would evaluate its impact on the world today. You know, these series of slides that are going to follow are basically highlighting the sort of economic aspect of China's rise, which is entirely undeniable. The figures, you know, are there to tell us in a variety of ways that China's pace of expansion has been extraordinary. And I'm sure that this side of the story is one that's very well known here in Brussels, and it's not something that I want to text, you know, greatly at length. Suffice to say, really, that China is now the world's third largest merchandise exporter. As you know, it manufactures up to 70% of the world's toys, for example, 10% of the world's office equipment. Obviously accounts for a great proportion of international trade. In terms of wealth, probably not really that impressive because of its large population, but it's an issue that we know about. And these impossible tables are merely there. I suggest that the last column is really what's interesting here, to make the point that over the last 5 to 10 years or so, China has gradually become, for all the countries in Asia, their top 1, 2, or 3 trading partner, whether you look at imports or exports. So obviously one does expect that, you know, given the pace and the scope of China's rise, its impact has been greatest in Asia. And that simply is the point. The other important thing to note, of course, China became the world's largest recipient of foreign direct investment in 2003. And when it surpassed even the United States. And this, of course, is often something which, you know, a great deal is made of for China. This has gone wrong. Right, I can't really move backwards, but if you just ignore that for now. The main point really here about FDI investments and so on and so forth is the fact, is the related, more important factor that China has attained so far, a level of economic openness to the world, which is unprecedented for a developing nation. I think this is the important point here. If you look at trade ratios, for example, China has an extraordinarily high trade ratio, something like 24%. Sorry, what am I saying? 64%, which is comparable only to countries like Britain with 55, Germany with 71. So a country that is essentially very much plugged into the world economy. On that basis, one hears then the Chinese particularly arguing that China's rise is good for the world, right? Because China's rise is not taking place outside of the international economic order, but actually within it, right? With the full range of interdependent benefits incurring to the rest of the world. So, you know, on the economic front, that rise of China, again, as I said before, undeniable. We can talk about in greater length the pluses and the minuses, the costs and benefits for different countries in Asia. But really what I want to focus on is the security dimension, which was what I was asked to do. And of course, let's start, you know, with the figures again. And this table is one that one sees very often as well. Top defense budgets in the Asia Pacific, right? And very clearly the United States on top, but China in a very firm second place in terms of expenditure as well. And we know China's armed forces have undergone rapid modernization since the early 1990s. Its defense budget rises by 10% or more every year, has done so for the last decade. And, you know, annual debates between China and US watchers particularly about how much China really is spending on its military. Right? What we know for sure is that it probably is spending quite a bit more than what the official Chinese figures tell us. And on this basis, there have been quite serious alarmist projections, particularly coming out of the United States, about what this spending is going towards and what it means for security in Asia and security in the world over the long term. At the same time, China is making progress in space. I think few people would have failed to have noticed, you know, that since October 2003, China became only the third country to send manned missions into space, for instance. And of course, in January 2007, China's anti-satellite weapon tests caused a great deal of worry in the West as well. So, not just a sort of military hardware, personnel investment, but investment clearly in technology as well, which is what's worrying. For those who would prefer to have to argue that, China may have a lot of manpower, but it's falling behind in technological terms. Clearly the Chinese are spending a great deal of attention and investment on the technological front as well. Now, those are the sort of superficial, that's the superficial picture. Taking a more sort of political overview of the question of so what for Asia, this table can be read, for instance, in another way. If you look at the United States and its expenditure, and its ranking as the world's largest spender on the military, China's ranking as the world's second largest spender on the military. Notice that in the Asia-Pacific region, we do have quite a lot of the world's largest spenders on the military to begin with. But notice also that if you look down the column of countries, all the countries on that list, with the exception of China and North Korea, are either US allies or very close US strategic partners. Right, at the sort of political dimension to start figures, and you get a picture that's slightly different. Not only is the US the greatest spender in absolute terms, it politically is also the strongest country by far, right, when you know the political military relationships of most of those countries in that list with the United States. In other words, China really, in absolute terms and in relative terms, has a long way to go, right, if it wants to try to catch up with the United States. Again, that's something which very often is downplayed in assessments of the Chinese military threat, as it were. This basically summarizes what I would argue is going on. I mean, if you focus on the military side of the table at the bottom, yes, China's military expenditure is the highest in Asia, but it's vastly outstripped by the United States. And the United States partnership with key countries in China, surrounding China, does pretty much ensure that we have a pretty strong deterrence structure in place, right, against potential Chinese aggression. We're running out of battery, apparently. And the other thing to note, of course, when one looks at what Chinese military power might be used for, a large amount of Chinese military expenditure, Chinese defense planning is targeted at the Taiwan Straits. Right? This is where this is the one theater of action for which defense planning is made. It is the focus of most of this, and there is a lot of investment on things like asymmetrical warfare, technological targets of the United States, warfighting systems in this front, and it's a very specific kind of defense planning. It's not a general defense planning to fight 2.5 wars or 1.5 wars in different parts of the world, like what the United States has, for instance. And fundamentally, there is the problem of power projection of the Chinese military being extremely limited today. Right? In Asia, of course, what most Asian countries are fundamentally worried about is the possession of blue water navy for China. Until China has a blue water capable navy, its threat to what is essentially a maritime region would be severely limited. We can talk a bit more about that in the question and answer, but generally that is some way ahead yet. Now, what do we do with sort of that general sort of scenario? Well, there are 3 ways to read this, right? So what for Asia, China's rise? There are 3 ways to read this. We can read it in a balance of power way and argue that, what we're seeing is lots of countries in Asia, the really important ones, India, Japan particularly, are balancing against Chinese power, right? Therefore, we're returning to some sort of system where countries in Asia and increasingly countries outside of Asia are going to have to choose sides as well. Basically, you either choose the US-led side or you choose the Chinese side. And countries line up in a balancing sort of system against each other. Of course, the Chinese government itself is very fond of this argument. It complains constantly, it has complained constantly since 1949 of being encircled by the United States and its allies. Right? And obviously this has some superficial logic to it. If, as I indicated before from that table, you note that the United States has a series of close allies and strategic partners all around China's periphery, ranging from Japan, South Korea, and now its new security relationship with India, and its security partnerships in Southeast Asia as well. And in here, of course, the most important development has been the tightening and deepening of the US-Japan relationship since 1997, but again with another boost in the post-2001 counterterrorism, war against terrorism period as well. This is a picture of a Japanese refueling ship in the Gulf. And as you know, the Japanese constitution has been rewritten to some extent in recent years to allow the deployment of Japanese forces outside of Japan's immediate vicinity in a rather sort of broader sort of way of defining Japanese security interests. This is something which causes a great deal of concern in Asia, and it is read as Japan cleaving closer to the United States in a sort of joint attempt, partly to contain China's rise as well. And the rewriting of the constraints of the Japanese constitution have extended to allow the deployment of Japanese troops on the ground, which again symbolically have been extremely significant. At the same time, of course, I mean, the other way, other evidence for balancing behavior is found in the smaller countries of Asia as well. This is a picture of the Kitty Hawk, which is the main U.S. aircraft carrier of the 7th Fleet, which is part of PACOM, the Pacific Command, in the Changi Naval Base in Singapore. Now, this naval base was built in the early 1990s after the United States bases were closed in the Philippines. And this base was built specifically to host American aircraft carriers. Singapore is not an official ally of the United States, but it essentially has an alliance, and it underpins the Southeast Asian section of that arc of American alliances in the region. The other way to read all this, and some people have done this, the alternative argument to what's happening in Asia in response to China's rise is to read Asian countries as having rolled over to the Chinese side, right? You hear this quite often too. Well, Asia is lost, right? China has risen in Asia, and it's now basically a Chinese sphere of influence. Asian countries are bandwagoning with China because it's strong, because they are returning to some sort of historical, cultural habit of Sino-centric order in Asia. Right? This is the big opposing argument about what's going on in Asia. And there is also some evidence for this, right? In a way, it's about whether you see the cup as half full or half empty, right? This is the half empty argument, really. People who argue about Asian states bandwagoning with China point to the evidence of these high-profile, terribly colorful Asian summits. This picture is from the East Asian Summit, which was first held in 2002, specifically a regional forum which excludes the United States and includes all the major Asian players. There you have the Indians, the Indonesians, and the Chinese. And others also point to the state of Sino-Japanese relations. And in spite of the sort of strengthening Japanese-American alliance, they say, well, but look at what Japan has or hasn't done with China, and the relationship is today better than it has been before. These two countries are not about to go to war with each other. Okay, they're not very good for for reasons of history and debates about textbooks, but nevertheless, the leaders of these two countries seem to understand that, Sino-Japanese stability is critical for Asian security. This is a rather amusing picture of Wen Jiabao on his trip to Tokyo, sort of doing a bit of baseball diplomacy. The Japanese are crazy about baseball. And similarly, people will argue about bandwagoning, look at Southeast Asian allies of the United States and say, but look at every one of them. The Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, these countries all have fantastically good, tight relationships with China, which are increasing, both in substantive and symbolic terms. This is Hu Jintao in the Philippines with President Arroyo. And China has gone to these relatively poorer, less developed Southeast Asian countries, particularly with large packages of economic aid and increasingly also military aid and offers of military-to-military relations as well, which have been taken up quite sort of enthusiastically by many of these countries. And this extends also to Australia, right? I mean, the Australians, if you count them as Asians, and Australians are probably, with the Japanese, the staunchest American allies in Asia, have given the Chinese a very good reception. And the economic and political ties between Australia and China have become increasingly strong. This was, again, Hu Jintao on the occasion of his address of the Australian Parliament when Howard was still in power, first Asian leader to have addressed the Australian Parliament. I'm just going to end quickly with my own interpretation of what's going on. I don't think there is balancing or bandwagoning. I think that's too simplistic. As I've indicated in what I've just said in the last 10 minutes or so, most Asian countries are doing both. Right? They're both strengthening their relations with the United States and engaging with China. Right? This is why you have two interpretations. And this, I would argue, is pretty normal. Most countries, most of the time, would do this stuff. It's called diplomacy, right? Very few countries, especially small ones, weak ones, poor ones, would stick their necks out and choose one side or the other, obviously. That's a very costly, risky strategy. So most Asian countries are actually doing both. But there is a reason for this. And my argument is that there is a hierarchy if you look at the security order in Asia. This is the argument that people, like my friend David Kang at Dartmouth University in the US, have argued, that there's hierarchical order because of the old Sino-centric cultural tradition in the region. My argument is that there is hierarchical order, but hierarchical order is led by the United States. And the challenge now is to try and incorporate China into the second place in the hierarchical order while keeping the United States on top. Right? This is why you've got those strengthenings of the relationships with the United States at the same time as you've had the engagements with China. Because the engagements with China are premised upon the security that is guaranteed by the United States retaining its position in Asia. Right? Take away that US commitment to Asia and all bets are off. Right, for Asia. So that's what's happening, and countries like Japan are very, very critical to this enterprise. And the Japanese also see themselves and their first strategic priority in regional security terms as keeping the US involved in the region. And that's what the strengthening of the alliance is for. This obviously has other sorts of implications. We tend to focus on the top two layers of the hierarchy. We think about China and the US. Oh dear, but when is China going to compete in the first place? What will happen when it does that? Etc. My secondary argument is that when you think about hierarchy, it means there are layers. And underneath the China layer would come countries like Japan and India in the third, fourth hierarchy issue. And my argument is that those layers below the first two layers are where one would get most instability. So really when we consider stability in Asia, what is often sort of neglected, Sino-Japanese relations, Sino-Indian relations, I think is where some of that power competition will begin before we see China being able to compete directly with the United States. So if other players like the European Union begin to think in Asia, then one of the very fruitful areas that would bear planning and consideration would be how to help to mediate those relationships between China and the other slightly more minor players, India and Japan, in the region, because I think that's where it's more unstable, and not the US-China relationship as such. This was necessarily very brief, but I'll stop here so that Axel can talk a bit more about the European Union side of things, and I'll be very happy to take questions and discussions after this. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn, for your very personal view on the stability in Asia. Now, Axel, you have the floor.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Gustav, also for the invitation to Brussels. Always good to be back. As you mentioned earlier, I was working in Brussels for 4 years, amongst others, working at the European Policy Center, working on EU-Asia relations. So I've been working on this quite a few years, and it's always good to be back in Brussels. Thanks a lot for this. I was asked to, I'm going to stay seated because I don't have any PowerPoint, so I'm going to stay seated. I was asked to do something on the EU's role or non-role in Asian security. What does the EU do, and how is the EU being perceived? At least in my view, this of course personal view is also, how is the EU being perceived as a security actor in Asia? What does the EU do, with whom, and what do the others think about the EU as a security actor in Asia? Of course, when you speak about security, you have to, of course, make a difference. Of course, there's of course hard security and soft security. So I'll today speak about hard security issues, not so much soft security. Of course, the EU, of course, is, and that's probably the only good thing I have to say about the EU today, is of course a very important soft security actor in Asia. The EU is by far the biggest donor of global ODA. The EU provides more than 50% of global ODA. So it's a significant donor, of course, and that includes, of course, many countries in Asia. So as far as soft security is concerned, economic security through humanitarian aid, development assistance, and so on, the EU is, of course, a very important player in Asia. I mean, that's true without a doubt. As regards to hard security issues, the picture, in my view at least, and I think that's of course debatable, and that's why we're here, is a bit different, meaning that the EU's role in Asian security is very, very limited, if at all existent, in my view. And I will try to explain in 15, 20 minutes why that is, at least in my view, the case. I would firstly say the EU, at least for the time being, has got no ambitions to play a more visible and concrete role in Asian security issues, at least the issues that are currently on the agenda. Above all, I would argue, and I've written this also in a recent paper that was published, Milano, above all on the Korean Peninsula, in North Korea. The nuclear crisis which broke out in 2002, or the second nuclear crisis which broke out in 2002. We know that since 2003, the so-called six-party talks are discussing or trying to convince North Korea to denuclearize, to give up its nuclear program, to give up its nuclear weapons program. Of course, the EU is not part of the six-party talks. Now, the only, in my view, the only security issue, at least leaving China's rise aside, of course, the only real hot security issue in Asia is, of course, the nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula, and the EU is not a player. It's not a member of the so-called six-party talks. And when you speak to EU officials, they at least that's what they tell me on or off the record. They say, well, the EU has never been asked to be a player, or has never been asked to be a member of the so-called party talks. We limit ourselves to providing North Korea with limited humanitarian and aid and food aid, but we were not being asked by one of the six parties to be member of this multilateral security forum. This is, of course, six players, of course, US, of course, North Korea, of course, which is the subject of the whole talks, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and China. The six-party talks being hosted by Beijing since 2003. Where are we now at this point in time? last breakthrough, or what was believed to be a breakthrough, was in 2007, the so-called February Agreement, where North Korea for the first time committed itself to denuclearize, to dismantle its nuclear weapons program, to stop its program. But 2 years after this February 2007 agreement, we have not made any real progress. North Korea is, at least for the time being, is arguing with the US over the terms of North Korea's nuclear dismantlement. And of course, in a couple of days, good news for people who write about this, bad news for Japan. North Korea might be launching a communication satellite, which South Korea, the US, and others believe is really a missile. North Korea, as it seems at least, has to return to launching rogue missiles over Asia, which of course is making progress on the denuclearization process in North Korea, increasingly different. Anyway, but the EU is not part of this, and that's probably one of the main indications why you could not refer to the EU as a real security actor in Asia. Because again, I repeat, the only hot security issue in the EU is not part of this. What does the EU do in North Korea? All the same, the EU, unlike Japan, South Korea, and the US, has established official relations with North Korea in 2001. Has in 2002 started to implement a very comprehensive, a very ambitious economic engagement program in North Korea. Looked very promising on paper. Was not very much by EU standards, only 35 million euros. But again, given the fact that nobody else is doing anything in North Korea, this was a lot of money. But of course, this engagement program has been on hold ever since the nuclear crisis broke out in 2002, and ever since the EU is continuing to provide North Korea with humanitarian and food aid, albeit very, very limited. Also, the last delivery of humanitarian aid to North Korea dates back to November 2006, so more than 2.5 years ago, which is also, of course, calling into question whether you could really refer to the EU as a player at all on the Korean Peninsula. Apart from that, the EU is providing or giving some money, some funds to European NGOs working in North Korea, which is significant and important, but again, is its own engagement in North Korea, its own engagement in North Korean security issues, of course, is very, very limited. So that was North Korea. The second issue would probably be what is the EU doing with the US and with Japan as regards Asian security? The answer is also here very, very little, despite the fact that that we have two dialogues which might indicate that the opposite is the case. Since September 2004, the EU is holding a biannual dialogue with Washington on East Asian security, and since 2005, the EU is doing the same with Japan. So the EU-Japan dialogue on East Asian security and the EU-US dialogue on East Asian security. I would argue, and I've argued many times, and I was corrected many times by Commission officials, of course, and by Japanese colleagues also, the only, or the main rationale, and I think that's debatable also later, the main rationale for the EU, or for the US and Japan to ask the EU to discuss security issues with the EU was the China weapons embargo. Remember 2003, 4, 5, even a little bit of 2006, a lot of talk here in Brussels on the EU lifting the weapons embargo imposed on China in 1989. The US and Japan understood that the EU was with that embargo, which was of course never the case, but to make sure that, it's my view, that there will be sufficient pressure on the EU not to lift the embargo, the US and Japan initiated those dialogues on East Asian security. When you look at the agenda of those dialogues, of course, the North Korean nuclear crisis is part of this. They are still meeting, but from 2004 till now, nothing, at least in my view, I haven't found anything of relevance, has ever been discussed between the EU and Japan and between the EU and US as regards Asian security. So meaning that there are no joint EU-US or EU-Japan security policies towards Asia. And if you try to find something on those dialogues on the Commission website, you don't find anything at all. So not even the EU Commission does mention those dialogues, which sort of gives you an impression how important these dialogues are, or how relevant these dialogues are for Asian security. So this is a bit of a, I wouldn't say it's a joke, but East Asia security have been discussed between the EU and Japan, and between the EU and the US for 4.5 years, but no joint policies whatsoever. So I think this dialogue that they have is a bit of a window dressing event, and the weapons embargo issue, of course, was really ever the only important issue on that agenda. EU-Japan, I'm very unfortunate because the EU's, well, I'm also fortunate, of course, but I can't talk too negatively about Japan now because I've got a very high-ranking official from the EU, from the Japan's mission to the EU here. But I tend also to be quite critical on EU-Japan relations, or what EU and Japan were planning to do, also with regards to security, not only regional security but also global security. We look back in the case of EU-Japan, we go back to the year 2001, when the EU and Japan implemented the so-called EU-Japan Action Plan, which featured more than 100 issues where the EU and Japan were planning to work together, including international security, regional security. But I would argue, I've argued in the past, and again I've been corrected by the Commission officials many times for that too, nothing of substance has been done by the EU and Japan together with regards to security, either in Asia or neither in Asia, nor anywhere else. So we have this very ambitious action plan which is about to run out. It's running out in 2010, I believe, because it runs for 10 years. The EU and Japan are currently, I believe, in the process of redrafting a new action plan, and I'm looking forward to seeing a bit more of a more focused plan next time around. Because for 10 years or 9 years now, the EU and Japan had these very ambitious plans on implementing joint security policies, not only in Asia but elsewhere. But very, very little or nothing, in my view, has been done until the recent day. And of course, what I mentioned earlier also, there was really no interest, in my view, on the Japanese side to include the EU more in Asian security, not least due to the fact, as Evelyn pointed out earlier, that Japan, of course, is still maintaining or is even expanding its military alliance with the US. They're currently revising, upgrading the bilateral defense alliance, meaning that there's very, very little room for the EU to become a security partner, or to become Japan's security partner. Very little relevance here, and I would argue only limited relevance on paper. In reality, they are up to date. No EU or no joint EU-Japan policy initiatives in Asia as regards security, I have to say. Of course, that is also not least due to the fact that the EU, of course, focuses very much on China. Of course, China is, of course, at least when I was working at the EPC, EU-Asia relations, the cinnamon for EU-Asia is always, of course, has always been EU-China. Very little interest, I would say, on the EU side to expand relations with Asia, unless it's China. So there has been, I would say, an obsession on the EU side to expand relations with China, and Japan has been neglected almost entirely. Again, still working, on Japan, but as compared to what is being done with China, is of course very, very low, I would say. And again, no interest on the Japanese side to include the EU more in Asian security. Back in 2002, former Prime Minister Koizumi commissioned a big report, commissioned a big task force to identify areas with no at least not to my knowledge. Maybe Oeta-san will correct me here, but at least until today, no real or no visible, no concrete, no measurable EU-Japan policy in Asia that would have made any difference with regards to Asian security. And also, of course, Japan was also not interested in including the EU more in. I would argue, at least due to one important issue. When we look at North Korea, what is the issue between Japan and North Korea? It's nuclear weapons also, but there's another issue very important. Japan, the so-called abduction issue, where well, it sounds a bit like a James Bond. It really happened in the 1980s. In the 80s, North Korean Secret Service abducted. And as regards, of course, the territorial disputes in the East China Sea, you know, China and Japan are actually talking about joint exploitation of natural resources in the East China Sea, because they know that this could be of interest to both Tokyo and Beijing, and Beijing and Tokyo are currently undertaking quite a few efforts to solve, not to solve that issue, because this issue is not resolvable, because there are different claims, and no government, neither in Beijing or in Tokyo, would be able to renounce any of these territories. But what China and Japan, for example, are doing is seeking ways to jointly exploit natural resources. So this is a very constructive approach to territorial disputes, at least between Japan and China. And this, of course, is only possible because both Tokyo and Beijing are on good terms again after 6 years of having very bad relations under Prime Minister Koizumi in Japan. But I would not go as far as to say that there's a upcoming military conflict or tensions just because China is upgrading its navy. I mean, the EU, no, not the EU, but the US, of course, very present in the region, and they have got quite a few aircraft carriers in Japan, stationed in Singapore. And of course, the US is by far, and also, of course, it's getting reflected in the difference between the defense budget in the US and China. And of course, by far, and for many years, it had the dominant military power in the world, including Asia. But you know that China is becoming more assertive about its territorial claims, at least in the South China Sea. That China is using the money it's making globally to upgrade its military, I think, is also normal, I would say. And I think the last nation on earth, if there was anything to complain about a country spending too much on defense, is the US. So I think this discourse, every once in a while, the discourse comes up about China's military upgrading its capabilities very quickly, including the navy, and then these things like the South China Sea happens, so on and so forth. But I think that the real security picture is much less tense than sometimes would be portrayed. Not least because freedom of navigation is, of course, as important to China as it is to anybody else. I mean, what would China do? Would China seek to block naval traffic in the Taiwan Strait? No, it's also very important to China. There's no reason for China to get engaged in any naval power games with the US or anybody else. So because the economic interdependence, interdependence in the region is, of course, much more important than any war games or geostrategic rivalries between China and other countries. So I think the picture is probably I would paint more optimistic than sure, incidents like in the South China Sea is making headlines. You read this in all the newspapers. Chinese Navy splashing with a American surveillance ship, and this is of course having big implications. But this happened quickly and was over very quickly. Nobody's talking about this anymore. And there was no implications. There were no real changes in U.S. military posture or behavior in Asia just because U.S. Navy was being stopped by the Chinese Navy, I would say.
Yes, the gentleman in the back.
Good evening, my name is Marc Laplace. I'm working in Belgian Parliament. I have a question for the lady. You have described the dominance of US in Asia. and I take notice of that. I accept, I agree. But can you elaborate a little bit about the relationship between China and Russia? Because this dominance of the US is countered by this alliance of China and Russia, by doing military exercises, by working together, by working on an alliance, etc. Can you say a few words about that? Thank you.
Yes, definitely. I think there are 2 points to be made. One, Russia isn't an Asian player. And two, and I'll say a bit more about that. Two, Russia and China don't have an alliance. It's a strategic partnership as well. You know, this is always one that I get when I talk about great powers in Asia. Somebody will always ask, how about Russia? And of course, if you look at the map, Russia has a substantial portion of its territory in the Far East. But if you look, again, using Axel's criteria for what constitutes, you know, a security actor in Asia, then Russia, as much as the European Union, doesn't feature. Yes, it is part of the six-party talks, but no one actually hears about what anything Russia does in the six-party talks, because it doesn't. And it has hardly any other profile in any significant security forum or issue. And Asians don't regard Russia as an Asian player in security terms. So it's a little bit difficult then to try and ascribe Russia, you know, some sort of significant role in the Asian security order. That having been said, I appreciate your point that many people would argue that China and Russia are forming some sort of a coalition or a condominium to balance the power of the United States. Not just in Asia, but in the world, right? Or in Asia writ large. If you want to make that argument, then the part of Asia that you want to look at much more seriously is Central Asia, not East Asia. Right? There's nothing happening in East Asia in concrete terms coming from that China-Russia strategic partnership. But there's a fair amount happening in Central Asia. They have very much backed, you know, or instigated, whichever way you want to put it, the actions of various Central Asian states in trying to terminate US bases on their territories, for example. That would be one. Having said that, though, you know, Central Asia is traditional Russian sphere of influence. You know, that's not at all comparable to the way East Asia is, as I would argue, American sphere of influence, or if somebody wants to argue Chinese sphere of influence. So de facto is Russian sphere. And if you, having said that, though, the problems that China and Russia have had between themselves for the duration of their bilateral relationship, even if you just want to consider from 1949, have been so massive that there is no Chinese military or civilian leader today whom you could ask who would tell you that they place a great deal of faith in their relationship with Russia, or that they expect that that relationship would yield them anything significant in the medium term in terms of benefiting China in security terms directly. I think there's a great deal of skepticism on both sides, Russians and Chinese, about each other. There is enough skepticism there, I think, for that strategic partnership to be fundamentally very, very constrained in terms of what it can actually produce in terms of coordinated activities vis-a-vis the United States.
So they are not unifying against United States dominance?
I think it would be very, very specific and possibly quite symbolic, right? But I really don't think that it would amount in the medium term to a serious sort of, you know, we're not going to see, it's not going to be like a US-NATO relationship. It's not going to be like a US-Japan relationship. You know, it's never going to amount. They tried it. It didn't work, right? And, you know, the Chinese learned more than the Russians that they should never rely on the Russians as a reliable ally. They're just not reliable in their experience.
My name is Axel. I am from the University of Pennsylvania. I have a question for Professor Berkofsky. My first question is regarding the activeness of EU and Japan in the international field. You mentioned at the end of your speech that EU and Japan are both soft power. They use And when I read the literature regarding EU-Japan relationship, they talk about the whole democracy, we have a very integrated economy, we have civility power, and more multilateralism, etc. But I was just wondering, how similar are we actually? It might not be a decent question because in Japan it's not the same kind of logic because Japan is a nation state and it's not. But and you also mentioned at the end that there might be a potential of some joint action by EU and Japan in influencing Asian security. May I ask you to expand a little bit on that?
I mean, look, it's not really my idea. You know, the EU and Japan drafted and implemented this EU-Japan action plan in 2001. You know, a document covering 100 issues of international cooperation, from A to Z, international economic security, peacekeeping, trade, so on and so forth. So a very ambitious plan, and in a way, a very typical EU document, reading more like a shopping list, like anything that can be done between two countries. The same is, of course, true for India. You know, there's also this very ambitious EU-India plan, and there's lots of talk about what they could potentially do together, but they actually do very little together. You know, at least as regards security issues. And in the case of Japan, you know, I think it's a lost opportunity. I mean, every time there is an EU-Japan summit, you know, the EU Commission President or whoever speaks about Japan being the EU's natural ally in Asia, and democracy is shared set of values, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying blah blah blah, but I'm saying so on and so forth. There's lots of positive talk. It is blah blah blah, by the way. There's lots of positive talk, but the action is very, very limited. You have those. I wrote a few papers on EU-Japan relations. We don't know how I did it because there was very little to write about what they're actually doing together. You have this huge action plan, and you have zero implementation. There's one concrete. I was very happy to. I was enthusiastic about this. There was one EU-Japan demining project in Cambodia. Everything else took place on paper and on paper only. And now the EU and Japan are the process of drafting a new action plan. I can only hope for the sake of the European taxpayer that there is more focus. You know, cover not 100 issues, but maybe 10, and focus on them. Formulate realistic goals. Of course, the same is true for India. You know, formulate a few issues where and how you can make a difference. You know, choose a few issues as regards to security, peacekeeping, where those two soft powers equipped with a lot of money. You know, maybe less now, but formally equipped with a lot of money and resources to actually implement policies, like the mining projects in Cambodia, like, okay, there was some cooperation in East Timor, for example, but issues like this, you know. But again, there's very little appetite and very little interest in Brussels in doing this, because the resources are very limited. The focus is China, or the obsession is China, still China. And in Tokyo, as regards security, there's this very ever strong U.S. influence on Japanese strategic and policy thinking. You know, it's all about the U.S. military alliance, and every time Japan is trying to do something with regards to security or international politics without the U.S. will come knocking at the Japanese door. So I really don't know. I mean, there's a lot of talk about what they could do potentially. And I really hope the next time they implement this action plan, I want to see some, as the European taxpayer, I want to see some use of the money that is being invested in this relationship, because the results are very, very limited. It's almost embarrassing in my view. You know, no offense to the Commission or to Japan, but if you have such a plan, try to implement at least 2 or 3 things instead of always, because they're meeting once a year for a summit, and when you look at the summit's agenda, you just change the date and it's the same. You know, every year it's the same. So they have not really implemented anything. You know, what they are concerned about at their summits is of course much more important the bilateral issues, deregulation in Japan, which of course is something the EU is very interested in when dealing with Japan. But beyond that, the high policy issues with all these big plans Brussels and Tokyo had, they were not being implemented. I'm sorry, that's reality. And next time around, maybe some of this will change.
Yes.
There we go. So that's the other view. Yeah.
My name is Rita, coming from the Japanese mission to the European Union. That is my personal view. I think the ongoing and existing policy dialogues are very important. It's not just a talk show. It's rich in substance from the annual summit meetings or political directors meetings or foreign ministerial meetings and various troika working groups, including the United Nations, human rights, or regional issues.
For example, and there's nothing on those dialogue on your website, on the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Japan, nothing, not a word, and there's not even, and the same is true for the EU Commission website. It's an important dialogue, as you say, at least on paper, to exchange views on East Asian security, but there's nothing on the Commission website. Why is there nothing? Because they're just too lazy, or nothing is taking place? So,
okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes. My name is Max Lin. I'm from SEPS Research Fellow. I have a question to Dr. Cole. I would like to ask you, what the other Asia countries like Japan, Korea, and the Philippines, this kind of Asia country, to see the rise of China? It feels like the same like Americans see China's rise is a threat, or they see China's rise is an opportunity. For example, a lot of American scholars see Taiwan issue is a test stone to see whether China can rise peacefully. But another scholar say China's rise is very good and welcome for Asia country. And I also have another question to Dr. Berkofsky. It seems a new trend, like China tending to build a bipolar world with America. And what the EU should do for this, especially now the Lisbon Treaty still have a long way to go. Thank you.
Well, the very short answer is the Asian view of China's rise is that it is inevitable. It's not a threat, it's not an opportunity, it's just inevitable. And that you understand. I mean, China's very large, China is in Asia. You know, it's not something that any Asian country has ever viewed as something that can be stopped. When the time came for China to re-emerge, you know, and again, this is historical. I mean, it's not new. It's always been there. So I think that marks the major difference between Asian views of China's rise and American views of China's rise, for example. American views of China's rise tend to start from blank slates, like many American views. It's as though, you know, now, China was never there before. It was just a blank piece of paper. Suddenly, this thing pops up and starts rising. Right? That's the. When you have that sense of inevitability, then it marks the kinds of options that you perceive yourself to have in response to China's rise. So, for instance, you know, this question of containing China is one that is very difficult in Asia. Because containment fundamentally means repressing the rise of China. Now, if you see it as inevitable, then repressing the rise is not an option. The only option you've got left is how to manage the worst impacts of this rise and how to maximize the benefits of it. And that's how the Asians see it in their various different capacities. Even the Japanese, who probably are the ones most often accused of trying to contain China's rise, absolutely see it as inevitable. They plan for China's growing power in the region. And it's not an issue of how to contain it, but rather how to deter it, which is a different issue. Deterrence doesn't mean suppress. It just means that you try and prevent aggression and expansionism. But you don't prevent growth. Right? That's different. You know, therefore, you don't find the same kind of discourse in Asia about China's rise as you do in the US. It's not polarized. And this is the problem I always had when I teach about this, because all the literature is American, so it's all about the rebalance of the bandwagon, etc., etc. And it's never seen in such dichotomous opposites. In fact, every country, as I said, in Asia is doing something in the middle. And the reason for that is because it's inevitable.
You were saying, like, correctly, that the U.S. and China are trying to create a bipolar world? Or?
Yeah, China is trying to build a bipolar world with American, work with American to become a bipolar. But China, in originally tend to work with the EU to create a multilateral world. But now they seems change the track to work with American more close and build the other kind of world order.
It's very confusing. I mean, as you indicate in your question, it's very confusing. When you go back 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, there was lots of talk in China with some European governments, the French and Germans, about creating a however-shaped multipolar world. That, of course, didn't go too well because there was no consensus in the EU to follow any of this rhetoric, of course, which is complete paper tiger rhetoric, this multipolar world rhetoric. Of course, didn't go too well. I mean, nobody was interested in building a multipolar world with China, where you have the US, China, and the EU as a pole. I mean, this died very quickly, but again, Chirac and Schröder back then, somehow made this an issue with the Chinese. But a very ridiculous, in my view, short-lived discourse. Then of course you have an equally. Sorry, I'm not trying to be too provocative, but you asked me for it essentially. The EU. There's another myth, another issue about the EU and China jointly implementing multilateralism. I mean, nothing could, in my view, nothing could be further away from the truth, because China is not interested in multilateralism. China is a bilateral power. There's no, again, there's no, it's not a bilateral power, it's a power which is interested in bilateral ties and very little else. There are no joint EU-China multilateral policies anywhere, right? Just because the EU, of course, and China are discussing now, they started doing this, because the EU wanted to do this, discussing, whatever, Africa policies that you have, or we will have anything resembling EU-Chinese multilateral policies with Africa, for example. So this myth, in my view, of China and the EU jointly pursuing effective multilateralism, as it is called in Brussels, I think it is a myth and nothing else. And about this bipolar world, news to me, I don't know what comes out of this, but I fear this is another dialogue or discourse that is taking place on the political rhetorical agenda, but not in reality.
Maybe I can help there. I think this refers to the G2 discourse. It's currently very fashionable to argue that China and the US are aiming for some sort of G2 within the G whatever we've got. I was just involved in a conference last week where there was vigorous argument about this. And I think it reflects, to some degree, an evolution in Chinese thinking about what kind of polar world we ought to have. And of course, from a European point of view, yes, it's possible to trace this to 2002, 2003 or so. But of course, in Chinese thinking, it goes much way back. Chinese preference has always been for a multipolar world. This dates back to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai's kind of thinking about what kind of world is most stable. And since sort of the opening up from the late 1970s and 1980s, the Chinese have always pushed for this, and the Russians too, like very much the idea of a multipolar world. And you find this in their joint statements a lot. And of course, what happened in the 1990s was Chinese woke up to the fact that the gap between them and everybody else in the United States was so large that the likelihood of a multipolar world being achieved in the short term was minuscule. Wasn't going to happen. Then you find Chinese rhetoric shifting in the second part of the 1990s towards much more acceptance of American unipolarity, that we live in a unipolar world. We've just got to deal with the fact of this for now. Of course, after Iraq and the erosions of American soft power in the world, and with the financial crisis now, I think certain elements of the Chinese establishment are beginning to think that this may be our opportunity, spurred by the financial crisis, to play a greater role, to sort of be more, not assertive, but to basically try and push our responsible stakeholder role in buttressing world order a bit more. And I think that's where the G2 dangler, it really is dangle, right, came in. I haven't heard that being substantiated very much, but yes, it's come out of the financial crisis essentially. So they've moved from multipolar to unipolar to possibly bipolar or something.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I just come back to the comment about China being not multilateral? Which I think that's a very simplistic way of seeing. Yeah. My name is Evelyn. I'm here a PhD student. So that to me seems a very simplistic view, because China, of course, I mean, using multilateralism doesn't mean like sacrificing your own interest. It's just very much in the interest of China to use multilateralism to send signals of restraint towards the neighbors and to be more acceptable, so to rise is more acceptable. So, and you cannot have China-EU dialogue being multilateral by definition, because there are two actors. To be multilateral, you need more than two, right? And the fact that China is somehow more than it has you can say that China has a more instrumental understanding of multilateralism, but it's still very much engaged in United Nations Security Council, in other UN fora. So that's a very much a multilateral approach, although they use it for a different purpose. But every state uses multilateral for a different purpose. So that idea that China doesn't use multilateralism doesn't make sense to me.
It makes sense to me if you if you say, okay, you know, China is a member of the UN, is a member of the UN Security Council, then by definition China is a multilateral power. The way I define multilateralism is that as opposed to bilateralism. You know, if China, and if you can give me any evidence of this, I'd be very grateful, of course, but I don't see that evidence that China on a global level is implementing multilateral policies with other parties. You know? Saying that China is because it's a member of the UN Security Council, and thereby definition a multilateral power.
No, it's not. I'm not saying that because they're a member of the UN Security Council, they are playing the multilateral game.
Yeah.
Not because of that, but of course that gives them another opportunity to play that out. But you see that the activity of China has become much more evident in the late 90s, just because this multilateral logic entered into the discourse of being a strategy to make themselves acceptable. So I'm saying, like, multilateralism, this multilateral strategy is a strategy to send restraint, to send signals of restraint to the neighbors, to camouflage its growth into the multilateral system. So if the rise of China is channeled through the multilateral system, it's less threatening. So the logic is very plain, and there's plenty of evidence about China. I'm not saying that they are genuinely engaged. I mean, you don't see which country. How can you find the observable implications of a country applying the multilateral approach? That to me is also very difficult.
Well, there's probably two sets of good examples, Axel, aren't there, of multilateralism in the Asian context: the South China Sea negotiations and the six-party talks. What are these but multilateral ways of dealing with conflicts and hardest cases? And China is instrumental in both, for different reasons, for very instrumental reasons, but nevertheless, that has been a turn from bilateralism to multilateralism in both cases.
Although, of course, I was talking about EU-China multilateralism. So the question was really, sure, I mean, these points make sense. I'm not saying that they don't make any sense, but the question I think was a different question. We wouldn't discuss, you know, the concept of China as a multilateral actor and the way China's seeking to make itself acceptable as an international player by engaging, you know, or by being a member of international institutions or organizations. The question though was a different one. You know, the EU and China for years now speaking about jointly implementing effective multilateralism, and there, for that claim, there's very little evidence. And I define multilateralism here as joint multilateral policies.
What is that multilateral policy?
Well, yeah, okay. Well, you asked the EU policymakers. I mean, they speak about EU and China jointly implementing effective multilateralism. But where's the evidence? You know, what do you define as jointly pursuing or implementing effective multilateralism? I mean, it's not my idea, it's the European Union idea. And I simply said that there's very little evidence or no evidence for the fact that the EU and China are jointly implementing effective multilateralism. Multilateralism without effective. So I don't really see the point. I don't see.
They use it. They use it as a rhetoric, and that has a function, right? It's not that they're for nothing that they use it in these documents.
Yeah.
I mean, that's already like a wide entry into the discourse. It is a good reason for that to be there. I mean, they don't just write random words.
But reality sees, reality is showing a different picture. You know? Before you go look at Africa, the EU and China are, discussing effective multilateralism. But of course, China's Africa's policies, of course, China's policies towards Africa are not being. There's no coordination. Let's put it this way: there's no policy coordination between the European Union and China with regards to China's policies towards Africa, even though the EU wishes that there were. I mean, for me, there's no. I really have to stick to EU-China here and not move to what you said, which makes sense. But I think you addressed a different issue than it was brought up in the question, I suppose. Right? So my point was a little bit different, very different. So we speak about joint policies of the EU, multilateral policies, or whatever you want to call them. They were on paper to implement it, but the evidence is not there, at least in my view. Yeah. Right.
Are there still other questions? I think we still have time for one. If not,
Yes. Sorry, I don't want to extend it, but
no, I had a question for Professor Go. Do you think China will engage itself more in Afghanistan, or will it follow a policy of we don't want to get involved in this?
Yeah, I think that one's fairly obvious. I can see no. The only conceivable logic to getting itself involved would be the stakeholder argument, right? Responsible stakeholder. But then this is not an international issue that could be construed in that way because this is a US quagmire. So, the Chinese have absolutely no reason to want to get involved.
There's a theory, which may be totally wrong, but there's a theory that one of the main aims of the US in that area is to ensure that China does not get control of the access to Pakistan and Squadron port and etc. So, do you think China will not react to that?
Well, the way to react to that is not to get involved in Afghanistan, though. The way to react to that is to continue doing what it's doing, which is to negotiate access to the Indian Ocean and to build its string of pearls, as it's called, which it's doing fairly successfully at the moment. I mean, they're not competing for the same basis or the same access point. They're just not, right? I mean, China's got the Burmese access points. It's got the Bangladesh access points, and the US is going for India. They're not competing the same way.
Thank you.
So I want to thank both our speakers for their excellent presentations and the way they dealt with the questions. So if you agree, we give them a warm applause.